Thank you. I've entitled the talk Translation Between Media. I kind of left it very, very open. But if I were to give it a subtitle, then it would be something like this. In the brief for today, we are exploring the relevance of intermediality for language pedagogy. And I probably would rephrase that for my own presentation today in terms of exploring the importance of mediality and intermediality in the study of translation. And by study, I also, of course, mean teaching, both private study but also the study in a group in terms of teaching. Now, why the importance of mediality and intermediality? I guess when I started teaching film in the frame of a department of literature, I was well used, as well as my other colleagues, of a certain suspicion by those that were teaching literature to those newcomers that were introducing film into the curriculum. And so I'm in a way kind of used to making a case why the study of film is very important in the contemporary context and also in the context of teaching literature. So in a way what I want to do this morning is to make a similar case why mediality and intermediality is so important for translation. And some of those reflections that I'm going to give you are perhaps, as Mona warned in a way, are slightly philosophical. And that is because, and I'll give you a little bit about the background so you can situate what I'm saying. My interests in terms of research, which I of course always translate into teaching, were initially concerned with mediation, the mediation between texts, or the mediation between a text and a performance text, but also the mediation between text and reader, or text and interpreter, and text and translation. And then I became increasingly more interested in the question of the medium itself, and the way in which the physical medium changes the way in which we receive, consume, or transmit texts. And there are correlatives to this, such as intermediality, of course, but also terms like remediation or transmediality, or the phenomenon transmedia, which is fans telling stories based on already existent films or comics. So, the three areas then that I've singled out for today that I'm going to address are medium, mediality, and intermediality. And where better to start than with the Tower of Babel? It's of course a myth that's dominated our thinking about translation, because it's a myth about the scattering of languages. And I think in representations of the Tower of Babel here in sculpture, we can learn a lot about how we think about translation. Now, the Argentine artist Marta Minujin, is there anybody that can help me with the pronunciation? Is it? Minujin? Was that okay? Minujin? La Torre de Babel. This is an installation which was done in Buenos Aires in 2011, when the city won or was named by UNESCO as the World Capital of Books. Now, the sculpture itself is comprised of 30,000 books in over 54 languages, and they were donated by libraries and by embassies and by readers. And I think what this sculpture indicates is that rather than a loss associated with the myth of Babel, this is a celebration of books, the multiplicity of books from different languages. But it's also it's also a celebration of the symbol of the book. And as such, it's a celebration of culture. Now, a similar installation was done by Jacob Gautel, La Tour de Babel, in 2000, I think it was exhibited, yes, in 2012, at the Palais des Beaux-Arts de Lille. Now, it's built of 15,000 books. Like Minuchin, like her sculpture, it might be interpreted as a metaphor for the dream of the Universal Library. And like Minuchin's work, Gautel is part of what might be called a bibliographic imagination. And I want you to keep perhaps that term in mind, because I'm going to offset that with a cinematic imagination later on. And I think one of the reasons why I want you to keep this term in mind is because I think we're all products very much still of print culture, and we're at the moment living at a transitional point in time. Now, by contrast to this very bookish sculpture, compare this with Anselm Kiefer's installation, which was exhibited in Bonn, at the Bundeskunsthalle in Bonn in 2012, as part of an exhibition called Am Anfang, in the beginning, and which I was lucky enough to see because I happened to be in Bonn at that point. As the title of the work already indicates, Babel, Balal, Mabul, there is confusion already in the title. It's already playing on that by giving you 3 different words in the title which have similar connotations. So the name Babel is a mixing up of the letters from the word Balal. And Balal in Hebrew means mixing, mingle, confound. While Matul in the Hebrew word is the word, Mabul is the word for flood. Now let's take a closer look. I mean, this is quite tall. If you were to put a human here, it would be like this. Let's have a closer look. When we take a closer look, we see trails of paper falling down the stairs and accumulate at the bottom of the staircase, like the wastage on the cutting room floor of a photographer's suite or an editing suite. And if we look even more closely, we notice that these ribbons of paper are each composed of multiple photographs. Strung together, the photographs are like a film reel. Each image depicts a tower. And some of these towers, or photographs of towers, were actually sculptures that he himself made and that were exhibited elsewhere. So Babel, Balal, Mabul is a mixed media sculpture of metal and photopaper, which in effect draws our attention to the mixing of media. It's as if the artist Kiefer is saying, to put it in Marshall McLuhan's words, that the content of any medium is always another medium. The content of film is photography, and the content of photography is painting, and so on. Intermediality is not only the name, as I shall explain later, for mixed media or multimedial artworks. It is also the name which suggests itself for this sculpture. In the beginning, Am Anfang was intermediality. This is what it suggests to me. And this is why when I saw it in Bonn, I was quite keen to write about it, and then I realized it would be opportune for today. While Minuchin and Gautel's Babel book installations belong, as I said, to a bibliographic imagination, Kiefer's installation, we might say, belongs to a cinematic imagination. And this difference is perhaps more clearly expressed in this sculpture, also bearing the same title, confusingly, Babel Alal Mabul. And it was exhibited also in the same year, in 2012, in Milan. Again, it's mixed media. And what you see in the center is a printing press. And out of this printing press come these photopapers that look like films. So what he's juxtaposing is an old medium, or a machine that made old media like books, and a more recent medium, photopaper, associated with film. And I go back now to the most famous of towers, probably partially made famous by Steiner's book, and the cover using this image, Peter Bruegel's Tower of Babel. And I want to draw attention to, as Michael Cronin has done, I'm quite a big fan of Michael Cronin's work, and he drew attention to the figures below here that work with tools. And so he drew attention to the importance of considering translation not only as text, but to look at the tools of the translator and how important those tools are. And this really leads me to consider what is a medium. But here is a quote first from Michael Cronin. Translation without tools simply does not exist. It's not so easy to get one's head around this particular statement. And then he argues, in a properly integrated approach to translation, it is necessary to consider not only the general symbolic system, human language, the specific code the language is translated, the physical support, stone, papyrus, CD-ROM, the means of transmission, manuscript, printing, digital communication, but also how translations are carried through societies over time by particular groups. And the other thing that interests me about this quote, how translations are carried through society. Now, translation in its very name suggests a carrying across. And that carrying across suggests something very physical. It suggests a materiality. So let me now consider tool, technology, and medium. And I'm going to sit down, and I think I'm also going to succumb to wearing my glasses, because I've noticed Vanity doesn't have. I can't see, and I misread words. So everything is much clearer. I'm
glad it's not just me.
No. This is a quotation by Aleda and Jan Assmann, and it goes to the heart of the point I'm trying to make. Everything that can be known, thought and said about the world is only knowable, thinkable and sayable dependently upon the media that communicate this knowing. It is not the language in which we think, but the media in which we communicate that model our world. That quotation is really a rewiring of how we used to think about the importance of language. In the 1980s, in all the discourses of post-structuralism, we got used to critics saying that we are spoken by language. We cannot think outside language. And here, this is making a similar claim for media. It's also saying that there is no culture without media. And when you think about it, without media having transmitted the texts that we now read and also translate. For instance, I said this once at a philosophy conference, and it didn't go down very well. I said there would be no philosophy without scrolls, because they wouldn't have, many of the ancient philosophers' writings wouldn't have survived. And there was some disgruntlement, but it's a basic point, and it's a basic truth. But the other point that emerges from this quote is that media are not neutral carriers. To say that media are not neutral carriers is to say that media shape their contents. So they're not transparent, but they work on the meaning, if you want, of the very thing that they carry. And I'll explain a little bit later more about this in terms of translation. But the other thing that this quote is saying is that media change the way in which we organize our knowledge, and therefore also how we organize our thinking. As such, they change the way in which we write, read, and translate. So the quote basically the quote basically recounts a displacement of the centrality of language to our modeling of the world. And it's this point that is very much derived from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And this is probably one of my favorite quotes, and I don't think there's any publication that I've produced in the past few years that hasn't had this particular quote in it. Our writing tools also work on our thoughts. And I pasted in the letter where this is from, and note the letter itself, which is written with a typewriter at the bottom, is all in capital letters. So already there you find the imperative for our tools work on our thinking. Here he's very much saying the typewriter works on his thinking. The typewriter helped Nietzsche because he was going blind, but it was a useful typewriter because it was very portable, so you could take it with him on his travels. But from this little sentence which he wrote, I think you can take forward an entire philosophy about media. And it's not just tools, it's also the entire environment. Technology as a framework, and this is what Martin Heidegger, in the question concerning technology, draws our attention to. Heidegger makes a distinction between technology as a tool or instrument and technology as a framework. According to the logic of the former, technology is a tool which humans use as a means to an end. And to this end, technology is a support system. According to the logic of the latter, which Heidegger associates with modern technologies especially, technology inframes us to such an extent that we are compelled to ask ourselves whether it is us who masters technology or whether it is technology which masters us. And again, this goes to the very crux of the thinking here. So media work, or tools, work on our thinking, media technologies work on our thinking, but also who masters technology? Because if we think of technology as an environment, or if we think of technology as an ecology, then we're all steeped in it. It's difficult to plug ourselves out of this environment. We might not notice it, but we're so immersed in it that we might not notice it. But it's difficult to separate ourselves from it. And given that there have been in history different kind of dominant media, print medium, has been dominant for many centuries, it leaves its traces in how we think and how we conceive ourselves. And just a juxtaposition of these two images. On the left-hand side, the famous painting, The Librarian from the 16th century, very much depicted here is a bookish man. On the other side, the Stern is a glossy German magazine, and it's Erinnern Sie sich, do you remember, it's asking us. But it's depicting the woman in this image as a library. In other words, the way in which we access our memory is here depicted in terms of books on the left and on the right, in terms of library, in terms of a book. But it's precisely this assumption that that our imagination is dominated by print is something that's being questioned now, that's in transition. Look at these images, for instance. The one on the left, called The Art of Seeing by Fritz Kahn from 1929. The other one on the right-hand side, I got from a website on research matters, some breakthrough that scientists had made in terms of how they could decode what a person is thinking simply by monitoring brain cell activity. And according to the announcement, this was done at Caltech in California, now we actually are able to read people's mind on a very small subset of things, but you can still read their minds. This is what they say. But what interests me much more about these two images is that Fritz Kahn in 1929, so this is also the year when there's a switch from silent movies to talkies, imagines the brain, the head, as a projection chamber. In other words, he imagines the mind cinematically. This is no longer a book man, this is a cinema man. And over here, well, we have Marilyn Monroe. She also belongs to the cinema. But there's something else also. There's already the idea of the computer that you plugged in, that is some kind of cybernetic or some kind of cyborg. I take this even further. Here are these images. I've called this the mind memory as computer. The left image is depicted as an X-ray. Now an X-ray is an old technology, and yet already in the head it's a new technology. It suggests it's a kind of computer brain. Now the new media theorist Lev Manovich, he has actually asked himself in his work how thinking is influenced by the computerization of culture. And here again, in the head on the right-hand side, we see the computer head. I don't actually know, I found this on the internet and I don't know in what context this was produced. But both these images, even though this is an old technology in terms of an X-ray image, and this is a more updated one because it shows us this head as a kind of virtual reality simulation, both of them suggest that the mind now works differently. It's more akin to a computer. So from book man to cinema head to computer brain. And the logic of this, what I'm trying to say is this is mediality. So I've moved now from medium to mediality. That media change the way in which we think and how we think about thinking, how we think about the brain, how we think about the mind. Indeed, the German media theorist Friedrich Kittler wrote in Optical Media that there is a historical tendency to employ technical media as models or metaphors for imagining the human or the soul. Already Plato imagined the soul as a wax tablet, the writing medium of his day. We're unlikely now to think of our mind or our soul as a wax tablet. We're much more likely to think of it as a network, aren't we? So already then you can see that the historical difference here. So media have become privileged models according to which our own self-understanding is shaped, Kittler says. Elsewhere in his work, he says, perhaps controversially, that media determine our situation. And what he means by media determine our situation is precisely, if you think of it in the heads I've just shown you, that our thinking is channeled by the media which surround us. Now let's take this a little bit further. I realised that most of my quotations are from German. It's a bit of an accident, I think. Sorry? Bertolt Brecht in 1931 said, and this is a very important quote, and I want to kind of draw two aspects out of it. The film viewer reads stories differently, but the person who writes stories is for his part also a film viewer. Now you could equally say the film viewer reads stories differently, but the person who writes and translates stories is for his part also a film viewer. In other words, translation itself and the practice of it is influenced by cinema, is influenced by film, is influenced by screen culture. And of course, cinema is the kind of first screen culture. Now we have the computer, which is another kind of screen culture, which incorporates aspects of film. So the point here is that practices of reading, writing, and indeed translating change according to the media in which we are immersed. And is this quote really that, on the one hand, kind of made me think about how media influence or change the way in which translation is practiced, or change practices of translation. And in an essay I wrote called First Steps Towards a Media History of Translation, I looked at both translation in the context of oral culture, but also translation in the context of manuscript or codex culture, and in the context of print, and then in the context of digital culture. And the questions I asked myself were, what role has media technology played in the history of translation? But also, what kind of impact have media transitions had, not just on this or that translation, but on translation activity per se? And it's interesting, especially to look at transitional moments when there is a shift from a written towards a more visual culture, as was the case in the late 19th century, early 20th century with the arrival of film. What happens to translation practice then? I don't know. I mean, this would need lots of people investigating that. But I also asked myself, what kinds of practices of translation can be associated with different media cultures and their particular hardwares? If we accept that media change the way in which we write and read, let me just give you a very simple example from oral culture, or from a culture deeply steeped in orality, but using scrolls. I mean, if you think of how the scroll is used, you have to hold it with both hands. That means when you read, you have to read it by holding it, so you can't make notes. You can dictate notes if you have a secretary, which was often the case, but it impedes the way in which you study that text. Moreover, scrolls were not divided into sections like the codex or the printed book now, so there was no index to find things very easily. And also words ran into each other, and they had to because there was kind of limited space. There was no interword spacing, which meant in order to make sense of it, you were likely to read it out aloud in order to give yourself the breaks in meaning. So it's a very different mode of reading. So therefore, what impact does that have on translating? And what I showed in this essay, I looked at Cicero in particular, and I kind of worked around the idea that on the one hand, it's one of the most famous translation definition, sorry? Quotes, yes, thank you. Which says that that he translated sense for sense and not word for word. And I put this together in the context of oral society because he also says that he translated Aristotle's Topics by heart. He didn't have the work with him, so he translated it from memory, he says, an entire book. Now there's lots of debates about it, but the point is that in oral society, when writing was not used as a way to memorize, because it's really a crutch. If we had better memories, we needn't write it down, we needn't write lists, and you know, the older I get, the more lists I write. And probably in ancient times people did not have those kinds of problems because they had a much better developed memory and they had certain techniques by which to remember things too. So it's not beyond the pale that he translated a book from memory, and he's also not the only example. So there we have a translation practice which is in tune, if you want, with orality. I mean, I said a lot more about this, I'm just giving you a brief flavour. Equally with manuscript culture, the codex, the scribe famously copies word for word. So I was trying to think about that, but I was also trying to think of the vestiges of orality that was still there in the Middle Ages, that was still there at the point at which the codex was the main medium for storing all output, all cultural output. And so on the one hand, you can see quite literal, or the claim for faithful word-by-word translation. You can see this linked with a practice of codex writing. But on the other hand, there's a despite the claims to be so faithful, there's actually real flights of fancy. So you can still see the tradition of orality in that, because orality has a way of telling stories that embellishes. Now, I won't bore you to go through all of this, but these are the kinds of questions I asked. How then does the medium itself change practices of translation? Because I had done all this research on practices of reading and writing for a book I wrote on theories of reading, and I thought, well, if that's the case for writing and reading, it must also be the case for translating. But so that's one way in which to look at mediality in terms of translation. And I just want to add one more thing. I think when we hear media in a current context, we always think of contemporary media, especially the new media. But print was once a new medium. Film was once a new medium. And we can learn a lot by looking back at history, and we can learn how people responded to that and the kind of discourses that surrounded these media transitional points. Now, if you remember back to the quotation by Bertolt Brecht that those who watch a film, they read and write differently. it's also a very early articulation of intermediality. And Brecht, in another context, made a similar point, actually predating cinematic ways of writing, predating it to 1895. But you know, running up to 1895, there were a lot of inventions that were very close to the cinema that then, you could say, got born with the Lumiere brothers. So, intermediality, you could argue it's a kind of updating of intertextuality. Now, I give you the famous quotation by Barth. I kind of reworked that quotation to suggest that just as intertextuality was never exclusively about the relations between texts, but also the interplay of texts within one text, so intermediality is not exclusively about the relations between media, but also the convergence, absorption, and competition between media, struggling within one medium, art form, and even within one work of art. So it's not just translation between media, but also translation within a medium. And I'll explain that a little bit more later. But just as groundbreaking the work of Christophe and Barth and Derrida were for rethinking translation, so intermediality could be quite groundbreaking for rethinking translation. Now, Derrida famously, or this whole quotation, and Derrida famously in his essay on Babel, suggested that there was such a thing as originary translation. In other words, language itself is never one, but there's always a translation process going on within language. And you could make the same point for media here. So, intermediality. What is it? So much of what has been written about intermediality, and this becomes very difficult in a teaching context. Now, I explain to my students what intermediality is, and they ask me, they want to read more, and I can give them certain things to read, but I can't give them other things to read unless they read German or French, because so much of it has been published in German, and so much of it has been published in Canada, and so little, in a way, in an Anglo-American context. So I thought it might be quite useful just to summarize some of those approaches. So intermediality describes the contact and translation zone between media. It also describes the complex ways in which media anticipate, interfere with, and draw on one another. You could argue that literature anticipated the coming of film. If you look at novels by Flaubert, for instance, Madame Bovary, there's a section when Madame Bovary has a I don't know how many of you have read it, but she has a love affair with this character called Rodolphe. And at the moment of their consummation of this love affair, there is a fair going on outside, a kind of agricultural fair, and the windows are open, and we hear the announcements about the fair outside, and then we hear the love talk inside. And it switches, like montage. But of course, Flaubert predated cinema, and so critics have argued that, in a way, he anticipates the coming of film. But that's not surprising, because film is also linked with railway travel, and railway travel, in a way, already prepared viewers in the cinema for the quick succession of images, because as you sit on a railway carriage, looking out of the window, and you see the countryside flit past, it's like moving images. So it's not, you know, it's not crazy to say that literature anticipated the coming of film, because railway travel, in a way, prepared it, but also all kinds of cinematic toys did. So intermediality describes the complex ways in which media anticipate, interfere with, again, and you know, the examples I give are from the field of literature and film, because that's, you know, that's my primary area of research. They interfere. You could say that modernism in literature is a kind of response to film. And I'll talk a little bit later about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, because the kinds of structures and devices you find in modernist literature, especially if you think of something like Dos Passos's Manhattan Transfer, is deeply cinematic because it's full of jump cuts and montage techniques. So that kind of cut-up fragmentary writing that you get in modernism is indebted, if you want, to the new technology of film. So media interfere with and draw on one another. Intermediality describes how media also refashion or remediate each other. So here the point that a medium is always the content of another medium, or some people have often phrased that the content of a new medium is an old medium, has purchase here. So intermediality describes the synchronic and diachronic relations between media. In terms of the diachronic relations, it's really about the transition between media, but the synchronic relations is if you look at how different media play within a given text. So how a literary text draws on references, film or painting or theatre. To study intermediality is therefore to follow the intertwined histories and transformative relations between old and new, mechanical and digital, word-based and image-based media. Intermediality describes media combinations, media change, and media transactions. I'll come back in a moment to those 3 points. So you could say there are 3 approaches, very broad approaches to intermediality. One historic, that takes media transitions into account and therefore is diachronic. A more philosophical approach, which is the one encapsulated by Nietzsche's point that tools work on our thinking. In other words, that mediality affects our thinking. And a third approach is much more critical, kind of critical textual analysis. Okay, this is one particular model of intermediality put forward by a critic called Uwe Wirth. And he says, ground zero, one medium thematizes another. And level 1, media change from one medium to another. So that's adaptation. But that's also translation. And I would also include media change from one medium to another. Even if you translate a text that was printed initially, if you were to translate that into the computer, even if you kept the words exactly the same, it's no longer the same text because your relation to that word is quite different. You don't hold the book in your hand, you scroll through it, and I don't know, maybe it's my generation, but when I read things online, they don't imprint themselves in the wax tablet of my mind as easily as when I read them on paper in a book. It might be age, because, you know, obviously computers weren't around when I grew up, or not personal computers weren't around. I don't know. But in any case, the point is that even if you were to produce a facsimile of an old text and reproduce this on the computer as a facsimile, and, you know, on the surface it would look the same, your relation to the computer is very different, and that makes the relation to that text different. And in terms of any kind of textual editions or any kind of translations, they're always embedded in a physical artifact, and every time they get translated, they also get repackaged and redesigned I mean, one critic argued that books are not written by authors. They are made by printers. They're designed, they're typeset by typesetters. Yeah? So to bring home the point that the material medium has an effect on the way in which it is received by us. And in terms of intercultural translation, of course, how does a book, once it gets translated, how does it get edited? And how then does it get re-edited? Indeed, D.F. Mackenzie, the famous bibliographer, said that every edition is a rewriting. And of course, you know, we're used to hearing that in translation. Every translation is a form of rewriting. That's Entre Lefebvre's point. Now, level 2 of Uwe Wirth is intermedial, intermeshing, medial hybridity. And that could be hypertext, but that could also be the Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk, the kind of multimedial artwork that then the avant-garde in the early part of the 20th century, later on in the 1960s, happenings and Fluxus artists combined. And level 3 is a kind of conceptual transmission, and that's really the example that I gave earlier on of how Flaubert's Madame Bovary was already a kind of proto-cinematic text. Now, other models have been put forward by Werner Wolf. He calls it primary intermediality, which is an amalgamation of at least 2 distinct media, and secondary intermediality, medium transfer, transformation of a work into another medium. So there again, you have film adaptation, but that part of intermediality is probably the one that's closest to translation studies. And then the final point is figurative intermediality, and I take that again to be the kind of traces in the literary text of the filmic, or the kinds of traces that a film has from literature. And then there's Irina Rajewski's work, and I mentioned these 3 distinctions earlier on. Medial transposition, again, so that's a transposition from one medium to another. Media combination, and she includes, amongst media combination, she has a whole spectrum. So on the one hand, it's avant-garde work, the multimedia, the mixed media work, but on the other hand, she also includes media like film in it. And that's a little bit more controversial. That's a very wide spectrum, and you might not necessarily want to put film in a category like this on the same, at one end of the spectrum, and then put multimedia works like Anselm Kiefer's installations on the other side. And what she calls intermedial references could be the kind of thematization of particular media in particular artworks, or again, proto-cinematic writing, filmic prose, and so on. Now, the examples that I've brought for today to apply this in the context of translation are those. Christopher Loke's Homer War Music. I've only just discovered this work. In fact, on my way to Manchester last night, I picked it up. I thought, no, I have enough time to go to Woolston's bookshop, and they had a copy, and I bought it. I mean, some of it is online, but it's much better to have a copy. And what I want to say about this is the opening of his war music. And if you look at it, this is kind of setting the scene, an establishment shot. Picture the East Aegean Sea by night, and on a beach aslant it's shimmering, upwards of 50,000 men asleep like spoons beside their lethal fleet. but it's a kind of long-distance shot. But then he goes closer, he zooms in. Now look along that beach and see. Now while Pope was able to translate the Iliad into verse, drawing fully on the poetic resources of his time, this kind of translation has become unthinkable in the late 20th century, as Matthew Reynolds, in a very fine book on poetry, published I think last year or the year before, points out, media like film and radio were precisely among the vehicles for the cultural changes that made Homer seem difficult to translate in the late 20th century. So Long meets the challenge of his cultural circumstances in the opposite way. In order to write a long poem deriving from Homer, he adopts the tactics of those media, Reynolds points out. Indeed, as several critics have pointed out, there is a cinematic quality in war music. Derek Mahoon of The Observer points out that the language of war music is applied with such barbaric certainty of touch that even at its most gorgeous or most ferocious, we're hardly aware of it. The comparison isn't with other poems, or even with prose, but with film. One is reminded of, say, Kurosawa's Kachimucha. And Alan Breen from the New Statesman has it, I quote, Logue seems everywhere at once, like a camera in a helicopter, continually varying close-up and long shot, description and comment. War music is at once an ancient and a modern poem, a triumph of virtuosity rhetoric. In both these citations, in fact, both these citations are used as blurbs on the book, thus deliberately making a selling point of film for this particular rendering of the Iliad. And here we have the zooming in, so the establishing shot from afar, looking at the beach, and then the zooming in, and we don't know at this point it's Achilles, but then we do know. Then kneel among these pains, burst into tears and say, Mother. So suddenly we have a close-up. We have a close-up at the point where there is emotional heightness. Finally, just to mention another brief passage, it describes a duel between Menelaus and Paris. And Paris's shield has been hit, knocking him backwards through the air. And Logue adds, bent like a gangster in his barber's chair. In other words, he's making reference here to film, Godfather perhaps. So on the one hand then, cinema makes itself felt in the very structure of the Logue's translation. On the other hand, perhaps rather more superficially, there are references to modern movies. Something similar can also be discerned in the most recent translation of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland by Norbert Hummen, published in 2009. I'll just go across this. This is, this was just to compare the way that Robert Fagles handled the same passage. The Wasteland, Norbert Hummen, 2008. The Wasteland is famously a fragmentary poem, which presents us with a heap of broken images and a cacophony of multiple voices. In this respect, The Wasteland draws on the two media of its day, cinema and radio. As Harriet Monroe already notes in 1923, just a year after The Wasteland was published, Mr. Eliot's poem surprises with an effect of unstudied spontaneity. While stating nothing, it suggests everything that is in his rapidly moving mind, in a series of shifting scenes which fade in and out of each other like cinema. The form, with its play of many-coloured lights on words that flash from everywhere in the poet's dream, is a perfect expression of the shifting tortures of the soul. In effect then, Monroe compares the mental processes of the poem's speaking personnel to the moving pictures. Similarly, many critics have drawn attention to the Wasteland's montage-like structure, which they have argued deliberately draws on the language of cinema. Norbert Hummelt's translation also brings film into the mix. And this is the English. This is a section from the Wasteland where two lovers, or it's actually a rather sad scene, where there has been an act of sex, I should say, rather than love. And the lover, so to speak, has gone now, and she's greatly relieved that it's all over. And the line that I've underlined, "when lovely woman stoops to folly," is a line from an 18th century novel, The Vicar of Wakefield. It's from a song from this novel. Now Hummelt translates this line with a reference to Hollywood film, Pretty Woman, starring Julia Roberts. And he says, "When Pretty Woman sich getäuscht hat." There is a mixture then here in this sentence of both English and German, echoing the multiplicity of languages and the intertextual quotations in the Wasteland. On the other hand, Hummelt is also deliberately making an intermedial reference to film. And this is also the case with a translation by Angela Carter of Frank Wedekind's Lulu Plays. I'm kind of going to wind up now because I've taken a little longer than I thought. She adds particular scenes to her translation which are not from the various versions of the original, and there are many different versions because the play got censored, but she takes them from the film adaptation by Pabst, which was made in 1929, and she incorporates those film aspects or those scenes into her translation. But she also refers to the character of Lulu in her translation as a kind of Monroe-esque figure. In other words, she is referring to a famous film actress, but also a kind of tragic film actress, but also a kind of actress that through her films attracted the male gaze. And these films are very much about the male gaze. So this is, in a way, amplified in Carter's translation. She often refers to the to-be-looked-atness of the character of Lulu. So what I'm trying to say is, here you have three examples of three different translations, which in different way draw in the filming. Sometimes very superficially, but only drawing reference to a particular film star or to a particular film. But sometimes also more fundamentally by using particular structures. So the point I was trying to make, and my next section really was about new media and the kinds of translation practices that we see emerge through using computer, like in the work of John Cayley, who makes on the screen visible the process of translation. So what I'm trying to say is that if we think in terms of mediality and thinking and writing and reading and translating, we might see very different things in the very translations that we study, that we look at. But we might also see something about our own practice of translation that might be influenced by precisely the media which are our environment. And the question I really want to pose, and this is the very difficult one in terms of teaching, you can't be a subject specialist in all kinds of fields. At the widest, my area is comparative literature, although more recently it's perhaps much more akin to comparative media. But I feel I read stringently in one area, and then I move to another area. I make connections, which is good, but sometimes I feel the lack of having stayed with one particular area. And I think lots of us in the field of comparative literature and translation studies perhaps feel this. And with the proliferation of media and all the kind of historical work that's being done at the moment, looking at particular media histories, including looking at the history of dead media that are no longer around, it becomes quite overwhelming. And it also becomes overwhelming just to explain the different categories, the inflationary categories that critics have used about the term intermediality, because they sometimes map onto each other and sometimes they don't. And the way they map or the way they don't map really depends on which particular discipline they've come from, whether they're more media historical in orientation or more philosophical or more literary analytical. So the question really in terms of teaching is the problem of expertise and how far you can stretch that expertise in terms of the disciplinary boundaries. And really it's on this particular problem or issue that I wanted to end.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karin. We have half an hour, nearly half an hour for discussion.